Do we have any iPhone or MacBook users listening? What about Samsung Galaxy, Amazon Echo, or Raspberry Pi users? Now, I can't see you as we're streaming virtually, but I'm pretty sure a lot of virtual hands were just raised. Now, what if I told you that anyone could break into your encrypted Wi-Fi communication? When you connect to a WPA2 protected encrypted Wi-Fi network, then even without TLS on the application layer, no one should be able to read the data exchanged between your device and the wireless access point. But that was not the case because your devices, and not only those that I mentioned, had this serious Wi-Fi vulnerability. That was the discovery of ESET's IoT research team that's dedicated to finding vulnerabilities in popular devices used at home and in the enterprise. We feel this type of research is really important. We participated on a Forrester report that went out earlier this year, and the conclusions were that consumer IoT devices are expanding the enterprise attack surface. Now, couple that with the fact that most consumer IoT devices can be exploited, and it's a disaster waiting to happen. Our IoT research team found flaws in a bunch of different devices, in smart cameras that allowed an unauthorized adversary to see whatever that camera saw. You don't want that, right? In Amazon Echo, in insecure smart home hubs by various different manufacturers. And smart home hubs are the gateway to your whole home or potentially your company if you're using them in a small home office. And the effect of that depends on what's connected to that smart home, so you can use your imagination. But Kr00k is our most impactful discovery yet. That's because it goes beyond IoT in the sense of cool smart gadgets like your smartwatch or your smart toaster. Kr00k affected billions of Wi-Fi capable devices, including your laptops, tablets, and phones. I'm Robert Lipovsky, ESET's senior malware researcher, and my co-speaker today is Stefan Svorenčík.
Hi.
ESET's head of experimental research and detection. But credit also goes to Miloš Čermák, who was the lead researcher behind this discovery, as well as ESET researcher Martin Kalužník. This and other types of threat research are in ESET's DNA, and it goes hand in hand with our focus for the past 30 years on proactive detection. So this is our agenda for today. We'll talk about Kr00k, what it is and how it works, its impact, how it can affect you and the security of your devices, and what you can do about it. Also, for the first time, we're going to disclose our latest findings into vulnerabilities which aren't strictly Kr00k, but are similar. Now, before we get into the specifics of the vulnerability and its impact, let's quickly go over some Wi-Fi security basics which are needed to understand how Kr00k works. First, I'm going to talk about Wi-Fi associations and disassociations and their four-way handshake. So the first thing that happens when you connect your device to an access point is called the association, basically a connection. For our purpose, when talking about Kr00k, we're mostly going to be interested in the reverse, disassociations. And these happen for a multitude of reasons. They can actually occur naturally, for example, when a client roams from one Wi-Fi station to another, and then we're talking about a reassociation. Or they happen manually, simply when you turn off the Wi-Fi connection of your device. All of these associations and disassociations are governed by so-called management frames. And an important thing to note, these are most often unauthenticated and unencrypted, and also can be triggered manually. What could go wrong? The four-way handshake establishes secure wireless communication. Now, without going into the technical details or the group key used for multicast and broadcast, I'll just mention that the handshake serves two main purposes. First, it's authentication, to ensure that the client is authorized to connect to the Wi-Fi, for example, knows the Wi-Fi password. and secondly, for confidentiality and integrity. So a unique per-session encryption key is constructed. It's called the pairwise transient key, the PTK. And a part of that PTK is the TK, which stands for temporal key. And this is used to encrypt unicast data exchanged between the client and the access point. So let's take a closer look at how that TK is used, how encryption is done in WPA2 with CCMP, which is the most ubiquitous standard today. Now, I'm going to simplify the scheme, not going into the details of counter mode and CBC MAC. Here we have some plaintext data that we are going to transmit and needs to be encrypted. The cipher being used in this scheme is AES. So we have that session key, the TK, which was established in the four-way handshake. We have a so-called nonce, a number which is only supposed to be used once. This also includes the packet number. These are used to generate the key stream. That key stream is then XORed with the plaintext data to get the encrypted data. Then, along with the packet header, this is then transmitted into the air. And the decryption is the reverse, and Stevo will talk about that in his part. So now that we covered the basics, let's get to the main part. What is Kr00k, aka CVE 2019 15126? This is a typical Wi-Fi connection between a device and an access point secured by the WPA2 protocol. The communication is encrypted using that TK, the pairwise session key, that was established in the handshake. So even if someone else captures those wireless network packets flying through the air, they wouldn't be able to decrypt them and read the content, right? Well, the Kr00k vulnerability breaks that. Here's an example of how an attacker could exploit the bug. They could transmit a crafted disassociation frame addressed to the victim device accepts it and disassociates, and data transmission stops. Up to this point, everything happened as it should have. But after that disassociation, one last fragment of data is transmitted, only this time, as you can see, it's encrypted with an all-zero transient key. And the attacker can intercept it and easily decrypt the content. So how was all that possible? Well, to answer that, let's rewind and take a closer look under the hood of that vulnerable device. Spoiler alert, this is the culprit behind Kr00k, a full Mac Wi-Fi chip. By the way, this particular one is from an Amazon Kindle, and it's only 1/8 of an inch wide, so taking this photograph took a bit of an effort. Stevo, tell us more about these chips.
So, every mobile device, your phone, your laptop, your smartwatch, which doesn't stop reminding you that you're going to probably die tomorrow if you don't make those 10,000 steps today. And even your intelligent vacuum cleaner, if there ever be intelligent enough to vacuum properly. Everything has its own Wi-Fi chip, which handles all the Wi-Fi communication. In all recent mobile devices, a full Mac chip tend to be the most used kind of chips in the market. Full Macs offer better performance in terms of power consumption and speed, and they are easier to integrate in complete products. This is a block diagram of one of them. As you can see, it's fairly complicated. This one also includes the Bluetooth part, but we won't bother with it. We'll look only at the small part of it which manages the whole Wi-Fi encryption. And this is where the magic happens. This is a MEC layer, short for Media Access Control Architecture. These are the small parts which handle all the communication encryption. Buffers are used to store all the communication frames for the time they are being encrypted or decrypted. The transmit engine constitutes the transmit data to and from the transmit buffer. Receive engine does the same for the receive buffer. The web engine encapsulates all the hardware accelerators to perform the encryption and decryption. It implements all cipher algorithms as WEP, WPA, WPA2. PSM is a microcontroller that is highly optimized for flow control operation. It also determines, based on the frame type and association information, the appropriate cipher algorithm to be used. So how the encryption goes? As Robert explained before, every time a device is connected or reconnected to an access point, after authentication and association, a session encryption key is generated, which is then used for all the encryption until the session ends. The transit buffer is being filled with data frames which need to be sent out. Web engine encrypts the data per frame with the generated encryption key, and the transit engine sends them away. So what happens after the association occurs? The disassociation frame comes through the receive engine to receive buffer. State machine evaluates the frame and sends the information up the ladder. There the information is interpreted as, okay, we are about to disconnect, let's drop all the encryption keys. A command to drop generated session encryption key is then sent. Since in computing you don't erase anything properly, you just replace it with zeros. The session encryption key is after dissociation overwritten by zeros. Here comes the term all zero encryption key. This is expected behavior, as no further data is supposed to be transmitted after dissociation. And it stays that way until a new session key is generated after the new reassociation and a new four-way handshake. But until that happens, the transmit buffer still may contain data. The transmit engine needs to send them away and continues to do so as usual. So all data which were left in that buffer after dissociation occurred are now sent away encrypted with an all zero encryption key. So when you could grab these frames, you can easily decrypt them into plaintext data. You know the encryption algorithm, you know the encryption key, you get the nonce from the header, and you can easily decrypt them then. The question is, how do you identify these particular frames in the air? The answer is simple, you don't. You just try to decrypt everything you see with an all zero key, and those frames, which after decryption match a binary pattern of the plaintext data frames, which is something like AA03, those are the ones which were formerly encrypted with an all zero key. One can ask, how much data can you decrypt after one disassociation? Well, the transit buffer has a memory space of 32 kilobytes. For comparison, 1 kilobyte is a couple of hundred words of plain text. So 32 kilobytes will be about 10 to 20,000 words, which is quite a few pages of a book. But you must understand that the buffer isn't always full when the disassociation happens. It really depends on the timing. So what can an attacker do with this vulnerability? Well, there are two ways an adversary can eavesdrop on these frames, a passive one and an active one. Let's begin with the passive one. As was already mentioned, the disassociation occurs naturally, moving around, changing access points, low signal strength, or just due to signal interference. Most of the time you won't even notice because of the quick subsequent reassociation. So let's do the math. Since this issue concerns many Wi-Fi chips, somewhere where there are many of these mobile devices in one place, like a workspace for example, there should be a lot of them vulnerable. Combining with the fact that natural dissociation occurs quite often, there should be all zero encrypted frames just flying around. And yes, they are. So let's grab them. So what do you think? Have we tried to eavesdrop at our workplace? Of course we did. Because you know, sticking your own into things of people you know is always interesting. And what did we saw? First we saw all vulnerable devices and access points to which they are connecting. But then, after decryption, we saw what kind of data are actually exposed. DNS requests, TCP, HTTP requests, website that people load, you name it. Actually everything that wasn't TLS encrypted. Because that's another layer of encryption on the IP level. Now, when we identified all vulnerable devices, we can get them to drop even more than they would normally give up for free. How? I can trigger this association between them and their access points wherever I want. And again, and again. And just like Captain America, I can do this all day. And this is the most dangerous thing about this vulnerability, because now you can gather this partial information. Let me get one thing straight. The nature of the data frames, which are eventually only a zero key encrypted and can be eventually decrypted to plaintext, is quite random. It really depends on the timing of the dissociation. But if you can invoke it over and over again, the vulnerability will manifest itself over and over again. And now you're in the information gathering business, just waiting until something interesting pops out. And it always does.
As much as I enjoyed those animations, let's demonstrate that this stuff really works. So we prepared a little demo in our lab so you can see the attack in action. We're going to use a wireless adapter in a so-called monitor mode. Now, some of you that played around with Wireshark are surely familiar with promiscuous mode, which is also used for packet sniffing. Monitor mode is similar, but it allows packets to be captured without having to be associated with an access point. In other words, an attacker can carry out this attack without knowing the Wi-Fi password. Okay, so this is our would-be victim. He uses his phone, is connected to our work Wi-Fi, see, work Wi-Fi. And they're going to check on their smart home. So connect to the smart home command interface, enters his credentials, clicks on login, and if those credentials were correct, which they were, in a moment he's connected and can check up on his smart home, see how his nuclear power plant is doing, turn it on, off, whatever. Now let's switch over to the perspective of the attacker. So the attacker has prepared his script for invoking Kr00k. The parameters there are the victim's MAC address, which would have to be known in a different way, and also that Wi-Fi, the targeted Wi-Fi SSID. And note that, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't need to know the Wi-Fi password. As you can see, some packets were captured, and we're letting the script run, so it's running continuously. So we're continuing to capture more packets. Now let's go back and see what happened over there. So in the beginning, we sent out that the script sent out that disassociation frame to the victim. Now we can see that the victim reconnected to that Wi-Fi, so the disassociation frame was accepted and it worked. And now we figured that the device is vulnerable because we were able to successfully decrypt this packet. As Stevo mentioned, this is that magic identifier AAAA03. And now we can see, we can read it in plain text, that we were able to decrypt with an all-zero key this packet. If we scroll down, there's another packet. We can choose whichever one is interesting, is useful for our needs, and more packets continue coming in. So let's select this one, this HTTP packet. Wireshark helps us parse some of those fields over there. So let's select that session ID. So this particular one contains the session ID. Copy it to the clipboard, switch over to our browser, and then the attacker is able, without knowing the password to the smart home interface, without knowing password to the Wi-Fi, able to connect to that interface and do whatever malicious mischief. And we will be releasing that testing script that we used in the demo on our GitHub after the presentation.
But that's not all. Here's a different scenario where it's the access point that is susceptible to this vulnerability. Similarly to the previous example, an attacker would be able to intercept and decrypt private data that was being addressed from the access point to your client device, even if your client device wasn't vulnerable itself. He can still get information about your connection directly from the access point. The difference is only that he will get to see only responses now, DNS and HTTP responses, for example, or a document being sent to a Wi-Fi printer. The fact that wireless routers and access points are also affected by this vulnerability greatly increases the scope of the attack. And it's also more difficult to protect against it, since the security of access points is typically beyond your control. A solution to this is to treat even WPA2 protected networks as insecure and make sure you always use encryption on the IP level, TLS or VPN.
Kr00k affected devices with Cypress and Broadcom Wi-Fi chips, and these chips are really prevalent. These are just the examples of devices we confirmed to have been vulnerable in our lab, but we know there were many more, and the total number of affected devices was well over 1 billion. When we were doing our initial Kr00k testing last year, we did not see the vulnerability manifest itself on devices with Wi-Fi chips from other manufacturers like Qualcomm, Realtek, Raylink, or MediaTek. But we later found out that some of those companies had other similar issues, and Stefan will tell you more about that in a minute. So what happened after that discovery? Well, we worked with the affected manufacturers through a responsible disclosure process. And considering the complexity of the bug and the two-step patching process involving chip manufacturers and then OEMs or device manufacturers, we agreed on a longer than usual grace period of 120 days. As far as we know, most major vendors have released patches. Now, not only would it be difficult for us to communicate with every individual device manufacturer that could possibly be using these chips in their devices, it would also be impossible. I mean, there is no public comprehensive list. Clients of Broadcom and Cypress, that's proprietary information of Broadcom and Cypress, and they didn't tell us. So what we did, in order to ensure that all possibly affected parties became aware of the bug, was we worked with iCASI, an organization that helps coordinate such complicated disclosures. And we strongly encourage other researchers in similar situations to do so. They were very helpful. Now I'm going to go back in time and explain how our research started, but more importantly, the connections to previous work. I'm sure for a lot of you, all of this probably reminds you of other weaknesses in WPA2 from the past, such as crack. Crack, being short for key reinstallation attacks, was research from 2017 by Matthew Van Hoff, which he also presented at Black Hat Europe 2017. And the point with crack, as the acronym suggests, it's all about reinstalling an already in-use encryption key, about resetting that nonce that I mentioned in the beginning. And in the beginning of our research, we discovered that Amazon Echo, the first generation, was vulnerable to crack. So we did responsible disclosure, and while Amazon was working on the patch, we were looking into the second generation of Echo. Now, the second generation was not vulnerable to the original crack attack, but it was vulnerable to a modification of that attack. And this modification led to an all-zero key being installed, and the cause of that was, you guessed it, Kr00k. So we continued our discussions with Amazon, we continued our research, until we came to realize that the problem was actually in the Wi-Fi chip itself. In the case of this device, the chip by Cypress. Now, Cypress bought the IoT division of Broadcom, and from our perspective, or from the perspective of the Kr00k vulnerability, the chips are basically the same. But since Broadcom chips were so widespread, even more so than Cypress, that's when we realized the scale of this vulnerability. And that's how cracking Amazon Echo brought us to discovering Kr00k. I put together this table to explain how the two are related and how they differ. Both of them could lead to similar outcomes: unauthorized decryption of encrypted wireless traffic. But there are also two separate issues. Crack is an attack, an exploit, and Kr00k, as we've explained, is a vulnerability, a bug. The point with crack is that a nonce is being reused to acquire the key stream. With Kr00k, it's about data being encrypted with an all-zero session key. Crack is triggered during that four-way handshake. Kr00k is triggered after a disassociation. As far as the impact, crack affected most Wi-Fi capable devices because it was about the protocols themselves. Kr00k affected most widespread Wi-Fi chips out there by Broadcom and Cypress. Now, the most severe manifestation of crack is the installation of an all-zero key. And Kr00k is also one of the possible reasons why encryption with an all-zero key can happen. So that's something they have in common too. I mentioned that our initial scripts for testing Kr00k didn't reveal the vulnerability on other chipsets than Broadcom or Cypress. That was true, but we did find something nevertheless. And Stefan will tell you more. Stefan?
So, after our former RSA presentation in February, the issue was brought to attention of many other chipset manufacturers. One of the chips we were looking into, aside from Broadcom and Cypress, were from Qualcomm. Our investigation found that their Wi-Fi chips are also vulnerable, but the exploit manifests itself differently. This is a Wireshark log of a residual frame after the association was invoked on a Qualcomm router. As you can see, protected flag is set true, and the frame appears to have a CCMP parameter, but the data aren't encrypted at all, as they should be. This frame is an ICMP echo from ping command. We reported the issue to them, and they approached it as a Kr00k variant and assigned CVE 2020-3702. The affected chip was QCA 9531, which is a highly integrated and feature-rich system on chip for advanced Wi-Fi platforms. It is used mainly in network routers. They resolved the issue with updating their proprietary Linux driver in July. The only problem is that not all devices with Qualcomm chips use this proprietary driver. In some cases, open source Linux drivers are also used, such as upstream Kr00k driver, for example. So a word of caution that these may or may not be patched yet. The good news is that new mobile devices with integrated system on chips, specifically for Android and Windows on Snapdragon, should be not affected by this issue. Other widespread Wi-Fi chips that we looked into were from MediaTek. We observed a vulnerable behavior very similar to the one observed on Qualcomm devices, on an older access router. But what was far more interesting, we observed it on the current Microsoft Azure Sphere development kit, which uses MediaTek MT3620 microcontroller. The MT3620 is a highly integrated, high-performance IoT MCU with the high level of security necessary for modern, robust, internet-connected devices. It targets a wide range of IoT applications, including smart homes, commercial, industrial, and many other domains. We've contacted MediaTek about these discovered vulnerabilities. MediaTek has informed us that they are aware of the issue and reviewed all Wi-Fi products, and that corresponding software patches to impacted projects have been released to different customers around March and April already. A separate question remains whether all device manufacturers have implemented these patches. With regard to other sphere, MT3620, the patch should be integrated into the latest operational system update. And how the vulnerability manifested itself on MediaTek devices, very similar as on the Qualcomm devices. This is a Wireshark log of a residual frame after the association was invoked on other sphere MT3620. As you can see, the protected flag is set true, but the frame doesn't have any CCMP parameters, and the beginning of the data is falsely identified as a WEP header. Here we didn't use ICMP echo because of the device limitations, but an application which sends UDP frames with a symbol pattern. As you can see, the frame isn't encrypted.
Okay, let's wrap up. First, a hat tip to Matthew Van Hoff, whose great research on crack brought us here in the first place. Then to all these companies with whom the cooperation went really smoothly and they responded to our disclosures professionally, especially Amazon. The joint effort trying to get to the bottom of what was going on was stellar. And there are a lot of other companies with whom we did not have that much cooperation, but they also handled the situation well, released patches, and so on. And we've been providing links to any security advisories we could find to our Kr00k webpage. So what are the takeaways for you? The source of Kr00k and the other related vulnerabilities is the Wi-Fi chip. Now, fortunately, you don't have to go and replace the chips on all your devices. How would you do that? And you don't have to be throwing away your iPhones either. No, you can mitigate the vulnerabilities with a firmware or driver update. The obvious advice that arose from our initial Kr00k discovery was make sure that all of your devices with Broadcom or Cypress chips are running the latest software versions. Now, that device has its limitations though. First, as a regular user, you often have no way of knowing what vendor made the chip in your device. And secondly, as it turned out, other similar vulnerabilities affected chips by other manufacturers. So we're going back to the almighty advice, just better to make sure to keep all of your devices up to date. And it goes for access points and Wi-Fi routers too, because as Stevo talked about, Kr00k affects those too. And it also affects WPA2 Enterprise. Now, in case you're a manufacturer of Wi-Fi capable devices yourself, and you're hearing about Kr00k for the first time, I highly recommend you get in touch with the Wi-Fi Alliance and your chip manufacturer. A final general note, many of those devices we talked about that were vulnerable, like smartphones, they get over-the-air updates automatically, or the user is at least prompted to install them. But others, like some Wi-Fi routers, for example, need to be updated manually, and this is often problematic. It could lead to attack scenarios like those Stefan talked about. And this is cause for concern in normal situations, but even more so when more people are working from home due to COVID-19. So these are employees accessing corporate resources that are responsible for their own home Wi-Fi security. So Kr00k is something that company CISOs definitely need to be paying attention to. For more technical details on the Kr00k vulnerability, check out our research paper. For up-to-date information, frequently asked questions, the script that we used in the demo, and links to vendor advisories, go to this web page we created dedicated to Kr00k. Thank you for watching. Do make sure to check out our lab's Twitter account @ESETResearch and our blog welivesecurity.com for the latest research updates. And now we will take questions if there are any. Okay, so thanks for watching the talk. To answer the questions, I think some were answered already. So the first question with the eight thumbs up, Yes, that was answered in the presentation. So it was patched in software. No need to throw your devices away. Then there was the other question that you need to know the MAC address in order to carry out the attack, but that's easy to get. How do you know, short of running the Kr00k script against a device, how do you know if it's been patched? That's a very good question, and we're not aware of like any good way apart from testing it or asking your device vendor. So ask your device vendor. We are posting the advisories that we're aware of on the website. In case there are any manufacturers in the audience and you want your advisory listed there, feel free to reach out to us too. So what else is there? Is it also feasible for 802.11ax chips? That's also a really good question. It's hard to answer because these are really fast, and we did not have the hardware to test that. I mean, capturing them and basically performing the attack, causing the disassociations on these types of chips would require much faster hardware than we had access to. We answered that. Since the packet is still valid for the receiver, would a man in the middle be possible to recreate the original packet and put malicious info?
Oh, I think they're asking about the injection part.
Injection, yeah, you can answer.
The injection part is not possible. We actually brought it up with Broadcom, and they assured us that that is not possible.
It was difficult. There are other factors that come into play there. You need to recreate some parameters of the data frames, and injection, it requires a lot more step and is altogether a lot more difficult. Where will the POC be posted? If you go to the links that we have in the presentation, I think that should be available. Or if you just Google Kr00k ESET, it should guide you to a web page we have dedicated to this, and from there you will see that. Or we also have it on our blog, We Live Security, and then on ESET Research's GitHub page, the script will be there. And I believe we answered all the questions. I was thinking at first that it was a Wi-Fi chip implemented by specific. Any ideas why it showed up in? Okay, that's a good question. Well, we have to say that Kr00k, that specific CVE that we talked about in the beginning, that did not manifest itself on Qualcomm and MediaTek. So that was also assigned a different CVE. They're similar, but they manifest themselves differently. We don't know all the details about the chipset architecture of every single chipset manufacturer, of course. We do think that the source also is similar in that they're, the transmit buffers. But
The thing is in the buffers. They handle probably the different size of the buffers, and that's the point that we saw the mitigation of the attack a bit later of it. But yeah, they're very similar architecture.
Vinity is asking TLS. So TLS can help a lot, of course, because as we mentioned in the presentation, Kr00k does not break TLS. So when you're using TLS or when you're using a VPN, that should protect you from this. So really Kr00k breaks the level of encryption that WPA2 itself is supposed to give you. But TLS, that's protection from a different layer. No. It's not plausible for this attack to be executed remotely. The attacker needs to be in close proximity of the Wi-Fi signal. That's actually in Stefan's home in Bratislava, Slovakia. The hammock. Okay, so that's all the questions, I believe. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.